Girls, Dr. Welch, these are my girls.
Hello.
Hey, you got your earbuds in and everything. This is great.
Oh, yeah, I got earbuds. We're playing with the mic level now. Am I too loud?
No, you're good. You're good. You guys hear everything okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear us okay?
I can.
Perfect. Okay, good. No feedback or anything. This is good. Usually it's like when I talk in the car on the VW car, it's like it feeds back up. People are like, I don't want to talk to you on this. Okay. Okay, well, everybody, Dr. Welch, thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to talk with you, and take it away.
Okay, well, I'm as excited to be here. I used to teach in an all-girls Catholic school in Cleveland, Ohio. That was my first job out of college. So I'm excited to meet all of you. And, of course, I'm always excited to talk about the Monkees. I've been talking about the Monkees since I was 7 years old. So, and they were on TV, and I was a huge TV-aholic. Luckily, my mother didn't mind that. Nowadays, we talk a lot about kids having too much screen time and when to start and when to stop it between social media and watching videos on screen and all that. But I, myself, and several other television writers I know are all happy our parents didn't pay attention to those rules because we all grew up to work in the business that we spent our childhood watching. So clearly, it wasn't wasted time. As far as the Monkees are concerned, I did always love them. I am a Mickey girl. That's my definition when I talk to people. And that's because my cousin was a Davy girl. And as children, we would practice marrying them. We would plan our weddings. And it was only fair that we shouldn't try to marry the same guy. That would be too much competition. So, yeah, exactly. So I chose the funny guy because she'd already picked the prettier guy. And that's fine because I think Mickey's prettier than Davy, but that's my personal opinion. Anyway, I went to college, and by that point, the Monkees were, of course, an old thing. No one had really heard much of them, but I still had some albums I'd had from childhood, and I would play them in my dorm room, and sometimes somebody would wander down the hall and go, oh, I remember that. Those guys are really good. And so it was interesting that they kind of stayed together across different eras in my life, which boiled down to when I was just getting out of college and getting ready to get married and move to California. It was their 20th anniversary concert tour. And they practiced that tour at a theater in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I'm from. So my fiance, then husband now, bought tickets for us, and we went to see, like, the dream of my life, because they broke up long before I was old enough to go to concerts. So the fact that I could actually see them when I had thought that was never going to happen was pretty hilarious. And, of course, we went and we had a good time. I actually have a photo that I took that night of me and Mickey at the party after the concert because they invited everybody in because they had such a good time. Yes, I kept that for a long time. I still have it, obviously, so it's even longer. Anyway, so then I did television. I wrote television for a while. I wrote for Beverly Hills 90210 and a show called Touched by an Angel. And then I did some news work and whatnot. And I realized that I really loved talking about television. I mean, I liked writing it, but I liked talking about its power because I knew as a child it had power. So I had that chance at that concert and it was very exciting. So then I grew up to be a television writer, as I said. But then I got very interested in what it all means, the impact of the messages we see when we're young. And television is in many ways more important than films because you pay money to go see films. But television comes into your home for free when you're not paying attention. So many of the most important television programs in the 70s, particularly, that helped change our attitudes about civil rights and feminism were accidentally sent into our homes. You know, you'd have to pay to see a movie like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And so the wrong side wouldn't choose to go see that and learn that lesson. So that to me is why television is more important than films, because children can be exposed to things their parents might not approve of and thereby learn what their own real opinions are. So I realized as a child, with my mom divorced and me alone, I liked the boys, the Monkees, because they were my big brothers and they were teaching me about the world as it existed in the late 60s. So from them, I was learning attitudes to be anti-war, and I was learning about I don't know about rebellious, maybe that's too strong a word, but I was learning that I didn't have to follow the norms. And that was a very important lesson for girls, young ladies, in the 70s as I was growing up and into the 80s, because of course we're trying to revive this concept of feminism. We're trying to take away that bad feeling that the word has. I always tell my college students, you're all feminists because you're in college expecting to get a decent job and to be able to contribute to your family and to be treated fairly in the workplace. That's feminism. It's none of those other bad things people have painted on it. So it was important to learn that you could go against the norm. You didn't have to worry about who your next boyfriend was going to be. You could worry about what you were learning and how smart you were. And so the boys being rebellious taught me that it was okay, I think. I mean, that's how I interpret it these days. So I saw that there were a lot of lessons that were accidentally slipped into that show. And so as a professor of television, which is what I eventually got a Ph.D., so I teach television history and film history and television writing, I started to look at why there were books about lots of other shows, but no books about the Monkees. And what were the lessons in the show? And why was it being ignored? And sadly, it was largely ignored because their messages coming from teenagers. And as you all probably know, we don't tend to take teenagers seriously. And that's wrong because you guys have a lot to say, as the boys had a lot to say, right? So I started looking into it and obviously sold the idea for the book on the fact that I was going to explore feminism in the Monkees, which no one could understand because it's a show about 4 rock and rollers. So it should be a show about 4 guys trying to get laid.
Yeah.
And it's not. I know. Oh, I said that out loud. It should be. But of course, in the 60s, there were some rules about what you could do on television, which kept them from going there. In the same way, I make the reference in the book that The Big Bang Theory, which is a charmingly funny show these days, and is about 4 scientists at Caltech, but it's really about which boy is getting to have sex with which girl this week. And that, to me, is of no real interest or value, because they've devalued the women on that show. But the Monkees never did that. Maybe because censorship didn't allow them, or maybe because they had a female writer on their show. Her name is Treva Silverman. You guys have not seen one of her episodes yet. But she went on to work for the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And she won an Emmy there for writing a very important episode on that show. And they referred to her as the female or the feminist voice in the room, which made sure the female characters were never just ditzy. They were women of some value. And so when I started to notice that in 58 episodes of The Monkees, there was never a girl who wasn't about something, who didn't have some substance to her life. Even in an episode called Royal Flush, Princess Bettina, which of course is a silly name, from the land of harmonica, she comes to town. And Davy helps her and discovers that some people in her administration are trying to kill her so they can take over the kingdom. And so, of course, the Monkees save her. But she equally saves them, which is a really important scene in that episode. They are kidnapped so that she will behave properly according to her leader dudes. And it's up to her to save their life, which of course is the flip of what we always see. It's always the poor girl getting kidnapped and she's stupid and we have to wait for the boy to come save her. So the fact that they flipped that in that episode really struck me. And then even at the very end of the episode, in the world where, you know, girls see a million Disney princesses and supposedly that's what we're going to grow up to be, she is asked, you know, she asks Davy asks her, you know, we could be together. And she says, no, I can't stay here. I have to go home. I have an obligation to my people. So she's not just going home to be a princess. She's going home because she has a country to run and to manage, like Queen Victoria, in the confines of this cutesy pie little sitcom show. So I was really impressed with that as their very first episode, that the girl was a woman of value who didn't think that the highest point in her life would be marrying Davy Jones, even though most of the other girls watching the program did think that would be a great achievement. So when I saw that, of course, I watched the show to find out how many other visions of feminism I could find. And I found several of them, which made me very happy. But then I began to look into the other things that we look for when you study critical theory, which sounds really like deep and dark and Ph.D.-ish. But it really means, what are the messages in a program? And you don't have to have a PhD to figure that out. You just have to focus and pay attention. And I do think that's why we choose the TV shows that we choose to watch. We enjoy the messages they're sending us, and they're intriguing to us. So after I was all excited about how I could do a whole chapter on feminism, which nobody expected, I also looked into what we call ethnic studies, which are a whole discipline of college classes that you can take. And these classes came into being after the Civil Rights Movement, largely because students in college back then wanted to know why they weren't in American history. Right? Women weren't rarely spoken of. African Americans were rarely spoken of. Asian Americans were rarely spoken of. If you live in New York these days, you could take an Italian American course in college and find out the contributions of Italians. So those classes didn't come into schools until after the Civil Rights Movement. So they're relatively new in that discipline and for students. And in ethnic studies, naturally, as it sounds, you study how ethnic people have been portrayed or represented in media and film and novels and such. So then I looked at the show and I said, well, guess what we know about the Monkees? They're all 4 white boys. Well, in the 1960s, that was all you're going to get on television, right? So how did they deal with other ethnic minorities? And there are some good examples, and sadly, due to their time, there are some bad examples. I was able to argue, maybe not prove is a big scientific word, but I was able to argue in the book that while they actually treated Chinese Americans not very well, they used some stereotypes in an episode called Monkey Chow Mein, and they treated Italian Americans badly. They were always hoods, they always had guns, they were always gangsters, which is the bad representation of Italians. But the African American characters who did appear, and there weren't many, but when they did appear, they were generally quality people. They were smarter than people around them. And so that was interesting. I think that was a distinct inclusion because of the Civil Rights Movement. But I also looked more deeply into the character of Mickey, not just because he's cute, but there are several interesting books on the portrayal of Italian Americans and African Americans and how in culture their cultures tend to match, that Italians are all about family as are African Americans, that Italian mothers are the stronger ones in the families, as can be African American mothers, that they are allowed in public to be louder, more boisterous, exciting people, and sometimes that passion is misread as frightening or violent. You know, Italian Americans were not appreciated when they first moved here. And so I was studying that, and I was thinking to myself, if you made the Monkees in the 1970s, when the Civil Rights Movement had really taken some hold, you would have had one of the 4 boys, he would have been an African American. But in the late 60s, it was too soon. So I have a whole chapter on how, in fact, Mickey Dolenz is the replacement for who would have been the African American. Mickey Dolenz is the most ethnic boy in that room. He is the weird foreign ethnic boy. He's got the afro hair, which was not normal back in the day. In fact, you may or may not know, in the first season, they made him iron his hair so that it would never be his natural curly fro. He also is louder and more boisterous. He, in effect, is the ethnic character on that show. And so I argue in the book that he paved the way for the African-American characters who would come into more of the sitcoms as we moved into the 70s and the 80s. So there's a whole chapter on that, which I found fascinating because then I got to study how Italians had been portrayed in films and television for so long. So that's pretty cool. And then I talk a lot about how television works. What are the gimmicks, flashbacks? You know, in the Monkees, they always cut to some old footage of buildings falling down or something funny to add to the comedy. And that's a style. And then really the whole book was built around the idea that this lovely college word, metatextuality, which means the people in the story know they're in a story. So they often stop and look at the screen and talk to you, the audience, which other TV programs did not do very often. There's a show previous to the Monkees called The George Burns and Gracie Allen Show, and they were famous comedians from the vaudeville circuit who did television. And George would talk to the audience as he watched his friends on a TV screen having their story, and then he would enter the TV screen and have the story. But he was the only show that had really done that until the Monkees showed up. And as you know, they're always doing asides to the audience, which is very Shakespearean, but it's called metatextuality. And so it was fun to talk about that and what were those messages that they were sending when they did that. And again, finally, we go back to the messages. The counterculture was just taking hold then. We're going to have Woodstock. We're going to have the Monterey Pop Festival, which our guys, Peter and Mickey, are going to attend as regular teenagers who happen to go, not really as celebrities. And the counterculture message that I think came to the 12 and 13-year-olds who were watching the show in 1967 and 1968 is going to affect how they relate to the Vietnam War in 1972 and 1973, and at the time when those boys are going to be drafted, because they're going to have been given an attitude about the war that didn't match the attitudes that came from earlier eras. Peter Tork, particularly being himself actually a hippie and also a Buddhist, was very much about peace. And he always made a point of including things about how war is not the answer. But it wasn't just the actors. For me, I studied the writers. I met with several of the writers who were still alive. They're in their 70s or 80s. And they're kind of adorable, actually, because they were hippies back then. And they'll talk about, toking in the writer's room and how nobody who was older than them recognized the smell and thought they were burning incense, and so they pretended that's what they were doing because that's how they got away with being high while they were at work. And they had some crazy lifestyles. But much of it was built around peacefulness, and that's what they were supporting. So Peter even says that their message got through better even than the Beatles, because the Beatles, again, you had to pay to see a concert, you had to pay to buy an album, but the Monkees came to you for free and offered you these ideas. I mean, and there's a bunch of episodes. I know you've seen a few good episodes so far in class, but there are several that really deal with the war very blatantly. There's an episode called Monkees Watch Their Feet, which is about an alien invasion. Aliens steal Mickey and they clone him. And it opens with Pat Paulson, who's a famous comedian from the 1960s, discussing how these aliens are destroying our teenage culture. And the problem is it's the teenagers' fault, because they're the ones who are involved in this war, far away from home. And if they would stop fighting, we could stop the war. And of course, he's, ironically blaming the teenagers who are being drafted into the war by the older generation. I mean, the funny thing about the show is the teenagers are the good guys, and the people they meet who are elderly are the good guys, and the bad guys are the people in their 40s and 50s who represent their parents and their parents' generation. So they were also speaking to that idea of the generation gap that was going on at the time, which apparently is over, and you guys all like your parents, so life is good now, right?
You were talking about how the kids were cool, the elderly people in the show were cool. It was the middle.
Exactly. It was essentially their parents' generation, which were the bad guys. If you notice, all the people who caused trouble to the Monkees, they're all in their 40s or 50s. When they meet older characters, they're always trying to help them, and the good characters, and of course, teenagers in their own world are good characters. And that speaks to the generation gap that was a very big thing in the 50s and 60s, a little bit in the 70s. That's kind of evened out now. The joke is now, because of cell phones and I don't know what, you guys all like your parents, and your parents are so happy because they didn't like their own parents and they were very depressed. So the Monkees' message about the younger generation having new ideas and being ready to run the world because their elders, their next generation up, was doing it badly, was getting them involved in Vietnam and forcing them to go. I mean, I'm not sure, Joe, if you've discussed Last Train to Clarksville as an anti-Vietnam War song.
Yeah.
But also Randy Scouse Git, obviously, is all about, you're telling me to go kill people. Why should you tell me that? I have to look like you to be a good person. So they were doing these amazing things, which frankly, a couple of years later, a show called Laugh-In came on the air. Another show called The Smothers Brothers. And the Smothers Brothers were canceled when they talked about the Vietnam War. But the Monkees had done it blatantly and no one had noticed because nobody took teenagers seriously. And that was probably the most interesting message they had, that they were worth listening to. And the people who listened to them changed their ideas and moved forward. And that generation of 12 and 13-year-olds then became the boys who were being drafted to Vietnam, who protested and helped end the war. So I think that their message got through and had an important effect on American culture. So that's kind of my overall view of kind of why I did the book and what I think makes the show important. Do you want to do some questions? I can yak for hours.
That'd be great. Who wants to ask the first question? Go. Like they're all nervous now.
Nah.
Is this okay? You answered a lot of questions. Well, let me. I want to ask you a question. I'm going to get the ball rolling. Did the music affect you as much as the show? I know you wrote about the show. Obviously, that was the focus of your studies and your.
Right. Oh, you froze again. You froze again, but you were asking me whether the music was more important to me or equally important to me than the show. That's a really good question. When the show came in the air, I was literally 6 years old. So I probably don't even remember as much from that time as I did from all the reruns in the 1970s when I was more like 10 or 11 and I watched over and over again. The show probably had the bigger effect on me because when I was younger, I couldn't buy my own albums, right? So I didn't buy them until I was older. Although, of course, the music was included in the show. I don't think I was old enough to understand the message of the music then. I did lean more toward the love songs that Davy sang because everybody wanted Davy to fall in love with them. I even bought my cousin, when she turned 50, I bought her an album of the Monkees that had, it's more of the Monkees, and it has The Day I Fell in Love, which is really Davy reading a poem where, he talks about being in love with you. And I sent that to her and said, hey, look, see, I made your dream come true. So the music hit me later. And I like the music, like Daydream Believer, for its tunability, its fun, positiveness. But I still don't think I looked at the messages in the music until I started looking at the show for the book.
We also, we watched Head as well.
Oh, fun.
And obviously that's a different beat, of course. We talked about that at length. One of the things, though, that the girls, I'm going to ask this for them because this is one thing I think a lot of you have asked me this. How did things, they're a little bit perplexed as to how the Monkees changed so much from when the show went off the air in May of 67 or April of 67 to when they came back in August or September of 67, I should say.
That's a good question. And that is because in the first year, they were essentially just actors being asked to perform in a show. They did not have very much control, and they didn't expect it. Actors didn't have a large say in what was going on. Nowadays, when you watch television, you'll notice often it'll list executive producer, and the lead actors on the show will have those titles. There are other writers who are executive producers who do the bulk of the work, but the actors have received that title because the show is successful, and that gives them the right to say no or to offer up ideas. They're not going to write episodes, but it gives them some power, which actors never had before. So in the first season, they're all four just actors who've been hired to do this job and are doing it pretty well, considering they won 2 Emmys that year. By the time they saw the power of the show through doing their concerts, which don't happen until the December of that first year in Hawaii, and then that summer between, they do the concerts all over the country, which is where you get the Monkees on Tour episode from, and they are besieged by adoring fans, and fan mail comes in like crazy. And the first thing they argued about was that they wanted more control, as we know, over the music. Once they gained that, they realized they could have more control over the program as well. It helped that Rafelson and Schneider, the executive producers, were relatively just a little bit older than the actors and were part of the counterculture and the hippie movement and all of that. So when the guys came to them and said, we're tired of, for instance, Mickey was tired of ironing his hair. I don't want to do that anymore. And they said, okay, you don't have to. So suddenly they were getting more of a chance to contribute. And of course, Mike wanted to be more in charge of the music and what would happen when. They got rid of Kirshner, and that was a big deal. So it's all about power. Television or films, it's all about a power struggle. If you're the big name and you're the thing that is drawing the audience, in the first year, nobody knew who these 4 guys were. So they couldn't claim that you came to the show for them. But after that first concert tour, they knew they were the reason you came to the show, and that allowed them to go to the producers and say, we're making changes. You would particularly notice in the second season, their clothing becomes much more androgynous, which was a weird thing. Boys didn't wear things like that. Boys wore shirts and linen pants to school and, jackets and whatnot. In fact, Gerald Gardner, who's one of the main writers of the show, when I interviewed him, he said he, of course, was an older generation person, and he had written a scene, a party scene at the pad, and he went to see them filming that day. And he went to the costume person and he said, there's a problem. None of these boys are wearing sports jackets. And, they're young men at a party. And the costumer, who was a younger person as well, said, Gerald, I love you dearly, but nobody wears sports jackets anymore. So they began to see that their actors understood the audience more than they did. And they were willing to give them that power. which of course explodes into the end of the second season, they wanted to do a third season, and they wanted it to be a sketch comedy show where they would do music as well. So essentially, they were trying to invent Laugh-In before it came on the air, which Laugh-In is the precursor to Saturday Night Live. There's a couple of guest music people, a few sketches by our regulars, that sort of thing. And the Monkees knew they could carry that off. But no other network was running a sketch comedy show starring young people. All those shows were famous people like Carol Burnett and people like that. They were of the older generation. And they did not believe that young people would come to such a show. And it's ridiculously stupid on the network's part, because the very next season, Laugh-In comes out, and it's all young people, and it's huge, and it blows ratings out of the water. So when the Monkees said, we want to do it this way, the network said, no, you have to do the show we've already bought, which is Little Sitcom. And they said, no, we don't want to do it. So they took their power, and there's an argument over whether they overstepped, and would it have been better to stay in the air another year and watch that growth in television. Because the year after they go away, Sonny and Cher also come to television. And now you think of Cher as this old lady who does tours. But Cher was this super young hippie who was deeply adored. And when Sonny and Cher had their television show, which was a combination of music and sketches, and it was a huge hit, it is what the Monkees could have done had they been allowed. So it's a pity that the power helped make the changes that work in the second season, but overstepping it kept them from having a third season.
I told you we watched The Devil and Peter Tork, and we watched... Oh, I'm sorry. We watched The Devil and Peter Tork. We watched The Produce Caper, and we watched Monkees Blow Their Mind. And I also showed them like Charlie Smalls on the show and Frank Zappa on the show. We watched that was from the first season, though, Monkees Yellow Mode. But and this is something that I was just curious about, because when I showed them Frank Zappa on, because a lot of these girls, you guys didn't know who Frank Zappa was. I explained who he was. Do you think that Nesmith and Zappa were making fun of the Davy Jones, Charlie Smalls segment?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I don't think so, because I think all four boys took each other seriously, and of course they took Charlie Smalls seriously. He was a songwriter, and he hadn't done The Wiz yet, but he had done some really good work, and of course they did respect each other. So, no, I don't think they were doing that. I think they were making fun of the show, the producers, and what they were made to do on the program, and how, particularly Nesmith, was getting tired of being a comic actor. He wanted to be Frank Zappa. He wanted to be recognized as this exciting new musician. So, I think he was totally making fun of the show and the trappings of network television, but not of Charlie Smalls.
I didn't think he was making fun of Charlie Smalls, but they were discussing time signatures and stuff like that. It was like they played.
Yeah, but that was them. That was them respecting music and talking about music and proving that they were musicians as well as actors.
Right. One of the things too we talked about is some of the little things they snuck in, and I think you addressed this earlier, that basically because they were young people didn't take it seriously, but the peace sign being thrown in the second season. Some of the drug references. I mean, the High Llama.
He's out back sleeping it off.
A little bit more worldly than maybe kids were back then. Do you think that the kids, did any of the 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, the older elements of the Monkees show, and this is another question the girls had, did they get it?
Oh, of course they got it. And they understood that they were being spoken to. They could be, the way we talk about Bugs Bunny having two layers of comedy, the adult comedy and the children comedy, they knew it, and they were probably sitting in their living rooms with their straight parents who didn't get it, and they were laughing, and the parents were thinking, well, that's not a very funny joke. And the kids were like, I know more than you know. Aha. So entirely, there's a whole, Timothy Leary in his book, The Politics of Ecstasy, he's got a whole chapter on the Monkees and how what they were doing was creating this secondary dialogue with the teenagers watching the program, which was like speaking a second language to them and made the teenagers take them more seriously. It's a really, really interesting evaluation that he makes of the show, and he made it in the era the show was on the air. This isn't in hindsight. This is at the moment. He's saying, look, I get the joke, and not everybody does, and that's what makes these guys more... One of the things I argue in the book is there's a few books on television in the 60s, and this one woman who I don't appreciate references the Monkees as plastic hippies. They're fake. They're not real. And my argument is, no, they were entirely so real that people didn't recognize that what they were saying was real. They took them as a joke, but they were getting away with all these important messages. I mean, I really recommend an episode called Monkee Mother, which stars Rosemary, and was written by Peter Meyerson, who's a great guy I met literally 6 months before he passed away. And he was in an Alzheimer's nursing home. And his son brought me and he said, I don't know how much my father's going to remember, but if you want to meet him, you can. And the first thing I asked him was, I only want to know, when I say the Monkees, what's the first memory that comes to your mind? And I didn't put this in the book because I didn't want to, it's not going to embarrass his family that much, but I will tell you, but you can't spread word. And this was like an 82-year-old man in a nursing home who looked at me and he said, oh, I remember a party at Peter Tork's house. I can't tell you that.
You broke. Come back. We want to hear this.
Oh, are we back? Are we back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. He said, I remember a party at Peter Tork's house where the most beautiful girl in the world stripped naked, climbed the roof, and dove into the pool. And I don't remember if we had sex afterwards.
Whoa.
That was his first memory of working on the Monkees. But then he did go on to tell me about episodes. But he wrote Monkee Mother, which I know. I didn't say that, did I? I didn't say that. But he wrote Monkee Mother, which is about Rosemary, who's a woman in her 40s who comes in and she's going to rent their apartment because they can't afford their rent. And she lets them pay to be boarders in her house. But it's cute and adorable. And it's very middle of the road. And you wouldn't assume that like a hippie wrote it, except in one part of the episode, which I often use in my own lectures. A scene opens on all four boys playing dominoes. And when they knock over the dominoes, Davy asks Peter, what do you call this game? And Peter says, Southeast Asia. And that means something to historians because the reason we went to Vietnam was because we had created in America a political policy called the domino theory, that if we allowed communism to spread outside of China, and Russia, then like dominoes, all the other little countries would turn into communist countries. So as soon as it started to spread, we were going to go fight. So he called it Southeast Asia because he was making an insult about Vietnam and nobody noticed. I mean, that stuff got the Smothers Brothers canceled, but people just thought he was being stupid because he was Peter and he's the dumb guy on the show and he didn't know that they were dominoes. But he knew so much more about dominoes than the censors understood. So there are definitely moments like that where they step outside of where they should go, but because no one takes them seriously, they get away with it.
One thing I do, and another thing that I think we talked about in class, how difficult was it for them to deal with, they use their own names in the show. The characters, in some cases, except with Peter Tork, were maybe somehow related to their true personalities. How did they deal with that hyper reality of like what people thought they were on the show and what they really were? How closely connected were the two in some cases, to your mind?
There's a whole chapter on that about identity construction, because we all construct our own identities in the real world. We're different people in school than we are at home, than we are with a boyfriend or girlfriend, than we are perhaps at work. And that's true in the real world. Now, you exacerbate that when you become a character on a television program. Even if you're playing a fictional character, some people tend to believe that's who you are. So that, in the beginning, is a problem. And so then for the guys, it was even worse because no one remembers who decided that they should use their real names. In the pilot script, they're all fake names, of course, because they didn't know who they were going to cast. And even when they cast them, you could use your first name, but give a fake last name, which happens also often on television. But for whatever reason, they all went with their real names. Even Mickey Dolenz, in the beginning, was going to go by Mickey Braddock, which is the acting name he used on a show called Circus Boy when he was a young boy. At the age of 10, he had his own show. So he was going to be called Mickey Braddock, but at the very last minute, they switched it to Mickey Dolenz. So now he's using his real name for his real character. The problem with that is what happened to them after the show. They got so ingrained as those characters that, there's a joke about, the Mickey Dolenz Happy Days story?
I didn't tell them about that.
Yeah. Happy Days, which you may or may not have seen in reruns, right, is Ron Howard and all those guys in the 50s being teenagers. Fonzie was the big character on that show, and when they were casting that show, it was post the Monkees, and Mickey Dolenz was called in for that casting session because he was still just an actor. He didn't know they were going to go out on continued concert tours once those ended after Head killed them. And Mickey went to that audition, and he came in second to, oh my gosh, Harry Winkler. No, I've just forgotten his first name. I've forgotten his first name. I'll think about it. Anyway, he came in second. He was likely to get the part, and Winkler actually saw him at the audition and said, "Oh, I can never get this part because Mickey Dolenz is here." But in the end, they decided Mickey Dolenz was a problem because when he walked in the room, he was Mickey the Monkey, and they didn't want Mickey the Monkey on the show. So their later careers were deeply hampered by this reputation on the show. Likewise, that happened to Davy, of course. He should certainly have gone off and had his own singing career like any of the other many famous guys, but everyone took him as a teen idol and that nobody would care about him as a grown-up. And even worse, Davy, as you know, came from Broadway, and he had a Tony nomination. I say in the book and in real life, Davy was the Neil Patrick Harris of his day. He should have been able to return to Broadway and do some other important musicals. But at that time, we had an attitude, Broadway was serious and TV was stupid. And if you did TV, you destroyed your reputation as a serious actor. And so he was never invited back, even though the age of really big musicals was continuing, and he would have suited that quite well. So the identity construction ruined their futures for a long time. That's why Mickey left the country and became a director in England, because there he could be taken seriously. The English represent the renaissance of a human being, that we have many talents and we ought to be able to use all those talents. And in America, we stick you with, you're a guitar player, you'll be a guitar player till the day you die. You can't possibly do anything else. So it hurt all of them, particularly Peter, who was truly a folk singer and wanted to go off in that world. But because he'd played the dummy on the show, again, he lost his reputation for being a serious musician, even though he was the best musician of all four of them. And he was friends with Joni Mitchell and Stephen Stills. He so belonged in that world, but the audience never took him seriously again. And the dummy story is a good one because Treva Silverman, the female writer I mentioned, she was there when they were deciding which characters they would all play on the show. And they had the comic was Mickey, they had the serious guy who was Mike, and they had the heartbeat guy who was Davy. So the fourth guy was either going to be the super smart nerd or the dummy. And when the writers got together and talked about that possibility, they finally thought it's much easier to write jokes for a dummy. So Peter became a dummy. But if you look at some early episodes, Peter's playing chess in the middle of a scene. And that's not what a dummy would do. So that's before they had actually decided which way they were going to go. They already had laid in a prop that spoke to the nerd as opposed to the dummy. So it probably hurt him the worst for the longest. And I think that's really sad. And above all of this, there's another identity that was constructed for all of them by the fan magazines and the publicists who had to make them be the kind of boy you could love in their real life, which of course wasn't being chronicled by those magazines at all. They were being invented to the point where when Davy got married, that was hidden for a year because they knew girls would find it wrong to have a crush on a boy who was married. So he wasn't allowed. So his wife had to travel with him, but hang back and hang out with members of the band so he could be seen walking alone without a girl or going to the Emmys with another famous girl so that people could pretend there were relationships going on. So it really harmed them in their future professional and personal lives.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Nowadays, nobody cares. It's like it's more interesting to see, well, who are they dating and who are they with? And, you know.
Yeah. Well, you go back to Neil Patrick Harris. There, of course, he didn't come out of the closet for a while because he thought it would ruin his reputation as an actor. He couldn't play a boyfriend. And it was in the middle of How I Met Your Mother when he was the slimiest, womanizer you could meet, when he finally said, and also I'm gay. And so I must be a pretty good actor because you believe me as a womanizer. And so it's become more and more possible for actors to let us know who they really are and still for us to enjoy their work.
Right. Guys, question anybody want to ask right now before we wrap up? You feel like, you did a great job.
Like all my questions were.
I said too much.
Is sure what deals. But the girl, would you mind if we took a picture all together with you around the computer? Guys,
No.
you want to get
Everyone
Hold on.
Oh,
Y'all like go behind.
Girls.
Oh yeah.
should I tell her?
Oh, that's so
There you
cute.
go.
Oh yeah,
Get
hold
the
her up.
You want me to hold her?
No, that's all right.
Get my little thing off of it.
1, 2, 3. Yay! There we go. I think about one, too.
Thank you
So,
so much.
Dr. Welch, I got a feeling you're going to see an uptick in purchases of the book. But also, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time. We love talking about the Monkees in class, and having you is really wonderful. I apologize.
Thank you for.
I'd love to have you again in the future.
I'd be more than happy to. I love to talk about it, and I love to see girls excited about learning and doing cool things.
Oh, they dug head too. I mean, some of these guys, they do really cool. We do a lot of fun stuff in here. I also I'll have to message you earlier. Do you know that of Monkees and Men record?
Yes.
Come on, I gotta send you.
Have fun. Yeah. Well, in about a couple weeks, I'm going to Missouri to do a book signing. I'm going to a film festival at Stevens College, which is an all-female college. They have a film festival of women directors and writers. And it just so happens that Saturday night of the film festival, the Monkees are playing at the Family Arena in St. Louis, and I'm doing a book signing earlier in the day, and then I'm going to the concert. So it's going to be quite a fun weekend. Yeah, it's very
And you've given them a copy of the book, yes?
I went to a Q&A that Mickey gave recently, celebrating the show. They did 4 episodes at a big theater in LA. And I went to that actually to meet up with Dave Evans, the co-writer of Road Escaper, and to give him a copy because he was marvelous to interview. And instead, the friend I came with pulled the copy out of my hand and brought it up during the Q&A and gave it to Mickey. So I think at the concert, I'll slide one on stage for Peter so that he feels like he's, equal and all that.
There you go. Well, listen, thank you again so much for spending your time with us. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Take care.
Bye.
You as well. Bye.